On September 15th, 2010, George Fleniken walked into room 348 in the Elegante Hotel in Beaumont, Texas, to start his work week, but he never checked out. As Greg's room was cracked open the next morning, he was lying dead with a cigarette stuck between his left index and middle finger. After a thorough analysis of Greg's death, Detective Scott Apple could not find any motive for killing the oil and gas man, and how he had received his internal injuries remained a mystery. What happened next? How did Brennan's sleuthing crack the case? Was the murderer eventually apprehended and convicted? We'll unravel everything here, but before we do, please kindly subscribe and turn on the notification bell for more in-depth true crime sagas. Greg Fleniken was a 55-year-old man who had worked as a chief engineer in ocean-going vessels, spending months out at sea, easing the exploitation of mineral rights on private property for gas and oil companies. He then reinvented himself to become a landman for the company he co-owned with his brother, Michael, in the small city east of Houston. Greg was an easygoing and classy guy who was loved by many. His daily routines were mainly to secure leases of mineral rights and land for drilling. Greg was slender and fit, even though he didn't exercise, but he constantly smoked. So much so that one could mistake him for a chimney. On Wednesday, September 15th, 2010, his company rented him a room in MCM Elegante Hotel off the Cloverleaf outside Beaumont, a 3-story wing hotel with a complete urban hospitality experience par excellence in Texas. Greg rolled his suitcase into the plush room 348 of the Elegante Hotel, boasting a cloud-like bed with a hand-woven hemp rug, soft metals, and an LCD flat-screen TV with a vast choice of channels. Greg loved a chilly room, so he cranked up the air conditioner, put on lightweight cotton pajama bottoms, sat on the bed, and leaned back on 2 pillows propped against the headboard. He picked up a clean white hand towel and laid his ashtray, lighter, TV remote, cigarette pack, and candy bar. He watched Iron Man 2 while puffing cigarettes, sipping a root beer, and snacking on a Reese's Crispy Crunchy bar. What else could you ever wish for? Watching his movie, Greg and his wife Susie texted. The following morning, Susie hadn't heard from Greg, which was odd as they always talked on the phone every morning while he was on the road. She called Greg's phone, but found no answer. Worried because her calls to him had gone unanswered, Susie Fleniken called Greg's office. His coworkers were worried as well. This behavior was unusual for Greg, so a couple of guys from the office drove to the hotel and banged on his door several times. Unfortunately, there was no answer. Greg's coworkers then called the hotel manager's attention. The manager unlocked the door and found Greg dead. He was lying awkwardly with a spent cigarette cupped delicately between 2 stiff fingers on his left hand. The room was incredibly warm, and his skin color had gone grayish-blue. They called for an ambulance and alerted the Beaumont police, and Greg's body was taken to Jefferson County Medical Examiner for an autopsy. Shortly after the ambulance left, Detective Scott Apple arrived in his cruiser. Scott Apple is a stunt cop, a fit man with graying hair that he wears combed straight up in spikes. Scott walked around the scene, looking for any physical clues that could be deemed valuable. However, there was little in the room to interest him. Greg's wallet, stacked with $1,000, was intact, so robbery was ruled out. There was no sign of a break-in, and no obvious wound or blood, aside from a 1-inch abrasion on his left cheek, where Greg's face had hit the rug, and curiously, a 1/2-inch laceration on his scrotum. Detective Scott questioned the neighbors, ransacked Greg's bags, looked for clues as to what may have caused his collapse, but found nothing to pin it on. Finally, after months of a careful and thorough investigation, Scott told Susie it was probably a natural causes thing. Susie was both shocked and grief-stricken, but she accepted on the grounds that Greg never went to a hospital despite being a chain smoker with a recurrent, lingering cough to prove it. He was a stubborn, slender, and physically fit man who was unmoved by the modern passion for health and fitness. When Dr. Tommy Brown examined Greg, the story that Greg's body told grew even more intriguing. His torso held an overwhelming amount of blood, his intestines had been torn, and there were 2 small lacerations in his liver, stomach, and a hole in the right atrium of his heart. He had also suffered 2 broken ribs. Greg's internal conditions reflected severe trauma. Thus, the medical examiner concluded that he bled internally to death and was deemed a homicide. Immediately, Dr. Tommy Brown tabled his conclusion to Detective Scott. He explained in detail that Greg had suffered severe internal injuries similar to car crash victims or someone found under a heavy fall object. The case seemed odd to Detective Scott. It was unlikely that the overly friendly Greg had been beaten up because he had no obvious bruises. He'd sat up, and that was his routine for the evenings, Apple said. He smoked a lot, and he had his candy bars because he had a sweet tooth. No, it can't be. Greg would give you not only the shirt off his back, but the shoes off his feet, said Martin of his friend. He was ruling out beating as the cause of Greg's death. Detective Scott worked tirelessly to find someone in Beaumont with the means, motive, and opportunity to have murdered the oil and gas man. Aside from a circuit breaker in Greg's room needing to be fixed that night, nothing unusual happened at the Elegante Hotel. Over the following weeks and months, Detective Scott investigated nearby hotel guests, electricians from Wisconsin who were working in one of the refineries in the area, and chased down every angle he could imagine, explaining the death of Greg Fleniken. But the people all said, "Oh, we hardly ever saw him. We don't know anything," Scott recalled. The only person not tired of searching after the 6 months was Susie Fleniken. She was determined to find her husband's killer, so she hired private investigator Ken Brennan, a former New York police officer and Drug Enforcement Administration agent. Ken Brennan is a famous investigator who is highly acknowledged for his thought processes when figuring cases out. When he took Susie's call, he was on the golf course. She was surprised that he picked up the phone himself and assured Susie that he would unravel the mystery. Brennan and Scott worked together. They reviewed the case file, analyzed the hotel security footage, and questioned the hotel staff, including the handyman who came to Greg's room to fix his circuit breaker. They then inspected room 348 again. The floor, the furniture, the walls, everything. They were both working on their hands and knees, shining flashlights under furniture, until Brennan had a breakthrough that he shared with Scott. "I said, I think I know how this guy died," Brennan recalled. "I said, I think I know when it happened. I think I know who killed him, and I think I know how we're going to catch him." Immediately, Brennan noticed the indentation in the wall. He rushed to check if there was a matching one in the electrician's room. Fortunately, there was. More interestingly, it had been patched with toothpaste. Brennan called Susie to get more information on Greg. "Your husband, was he left or right-handed?" he asked. Susie confirmed that he was right-handed. Brennan then asked that when he smoked, did he smoke with the cigarette in his left hand or his right hand? Susie replied that he always smoked with his right hand. Brennan measured the hole height against his hip and checked the indentation, and the two lined up and marked the trajectory of a bullet. The small, neat hole in room 349 marked the bullet entry, and the larger hole in 348 its exit. A laser showed that the bullet would have struck the bed where Greg had been sitting, drinking, smoking, eating candy, and watching his movie. To get Greg's killer or killers to justice, Brennan and Scott would have to get Dr. Tommy Brown of coroner to rewrite his findings, since it would be insane to argue in court that a defendant had shot someone if the medical examiner's office had concluded that the victim had not been shot. Unfortunately, the detectives couldn't examine the body because he'd been cremated, but they scoured the autopsy report. "Listen, Doc," Brennan proposed. "Let's just take out the photos from the autopsy and go through them and see what we can find." After thoroughly examining the autopsy report, the two parties agreed that Greg had been shot in the scrotum and the bullet had bounced around inside his body, causing all of the internal damage that had been observed. It had been more than 7 months since Tim Steinmetz and Lance Mueller had come home from the job in Beaumont, where they lounged in room 349 of the Elegante Hotel. They must have been highly perplexed to be invited by the police for an interview. As the investigators walked them through the evening, asking many questions, they eventually explained to the investigators what had happened the night that Greg died. The men had been drinking with Lance Mueller in his room. Lance asked his friend Pisano to bring a bottle of whiskey from his car and also to bring up his pistol, a 9mm Ruger. Lance picked up the gun, pointed it at Steinmetz, who rebuked him, and he was pointing it in Pisano's direction at the foot of the bed when it went off, piercing the wall and entering the other room. Lance freaked out and bundled the gun into the car. When he returned, Pisano had left for his room. Lance and Steinmetz walked to the bar, not knowing that they had shot Greg to death. In 2012, Lance Mueller was found guilty of the crime and sentenced to 10 years. Do you feel that chances are, if Tim Lance had checked on Greg and summoned help, he never would have served a day in jail? Let us know what you think in the comment section below. Please also be sure to check out our other binge-worthy true crime stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.